Theron, and Chiraka. This video will be the continuation of the narration with some commentary along the way of William Walker Atkinson's, under his pen name Theron Q. Dumont's book, The Mastermind, chapter called Mastery of Reasoning. We left off in the previous video at the end of the section of that chapter called Reasoning by Induction. We'll pick up here with Reasoning by Deduction, and I need to state, to correct something that I said in my comments about inductive reasoning in that previous video. At some point in there, I made a mistake. I said something, I stated something incorrectly. It was just the misuse of a term, the misappropriation of a term, misapplication of a term. And I have clarified this in my description area below the posting of that video. So when you play that video, part 1 of Mastery of Reasoning in the book Mastermind, you'll see in the description below it my correction of the error. And I'm going to state it here as well. I was just throwing an incidental bit of information out there, an additional bit of information about inductive reasoning, and I said that in inductive reasoning, if we have a well-formed inductive argument and we know that the premises are true, or if the premises are in fact true, I guess whether or not we actually know it, but to be making this assertion, we're kind of assuming that we know the premises are true, regardless of our knowledge of it. If the premises are in fact true, what we have is, what I said was a sound argument. Well, that's not the case. It's called a cogent argument in that case. A sound argument is the corresponding name given to a deductive argument. If we have a well-formed, that is valid, deductive argument, and we know the premises, or the premises are true, then that argument is called a sound one. So when people refer to sound reasoning, they may not be meaning exactly that. They may not mean exactly that. They might mean, well, that's just good logic. But more specifically, more technically, let's say, a sound argument or sound reasoning, that phrase soundness, refers to deductive reasoning when it is well formed, when it is of an actually valid structure, one that works, one that guarantees the truth of the conclusion given the truth of the premises, and the premises do so happen to be true, then that argument is called sound. So I used the word sound and applied it to the wrong form of reasoning. I applied it to induction, whereby it actually applies to deduction. All right. Moving forward, now that I have clarified that error, reasoning by induction is based on the axiom, what is true of the whole is true of its parts. Now, that's the phase of reasoning which we've just considered, reasoning by induction. We discovered a general law through and by an examination of particular facts. Remember, we went from specific to general. Now, in the present phase of reasoning, the one before us, reasoning by deduction, we seek to discover particular facts by an application of the aforesaid law. An example of this form of reasoning is as follows. Now notice the parallel here with the classic example I gave in the previous video. The classic example, remember, being premise number 1, assertion number 1, or proposition number 1 being all men are mortal. And the second, the following proposition being, well, Socrates is a man. And the concluding proposition being, well, therefore, Socrates is mortal. That is the simplest form of deductive reasoning, the simplest valid form of it. Notice the parallel in this example. Assuming as a general law or principle that all fish are cold-blooded. See the parallel there? It's the same structure. All men are mortal. All fish are cold-blooded. And then making the statement regarding some living creature placed before us, this creature is a fish. This creature is a fish. That corresponds within our classic syllogism. All right. Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. And then number 2, Socrates is a man. Same structure as all fish are cold-blooded. This creature is a fish. Well, then we reach by deductive reasoning the conclusion that this creature is cold-blooded. Just like in the classic example, we reached the conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. Same structure. We make this judgment purely by reason, you see. Purely by reason. In this example here, about the fish, because in this example, we're just taking it to be the case that we haven't actually examined that particular fish. If the creature was afterward found out to not to be cold-blooded, actually, well, then we would be justified in reasoning thusly. All fish are cold-blooded. This creature isn't cold-blooded. Therefore, this creature is not a fish. Well, that's another way to use that basic form of deductive argument. It's another valid conclusion that could be reached by just changing the one factor in that form. In the above simple example, we have an illustration of the general principles of all reasoning by deduction. All of our reasoning of this kind follows the same general rule. Now, we may object here that we don't consciously follow this rule. But, consciously or unconsciously, the rule is followed by all people arriving at conclusions by this form of reasoning. It's still followed whether or not we know it. We're not conscious of the several steps of the process usually, for we have become so accustomed to them from early childhood that they become almost automatic, or I guess you could say reflex with us. As a writer says, an unidentified writer says, most persons are surprised when they find out that they've been using logical forms more or less correctly without having realized it. A large number of even of educated persons have no clear idea of what logic is. Yet in a certain way, everyone must have been a logician since he began to speak. So in the same manner that we all engage in what we might call scientific method throughout the day, more or less correctly, the same applies with inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Becoming aware of it, learning a little bit more about how it works, helps us to use these things more effectively, efficiently, and appropriately. Now, we're going to try to avoid the use of technical logical terms as explanations here, but we've already done a little bit of that. When I used the word syllogism, when I used the word soundness, now the word cogent. Let's just stop for a moment to consider just one technical term, which we've already spoken of, and I just reiterated again, the syllogism. The syllogism has been defined as this. Panther, get down. Come on. Come on. Come on. Get down. Good girl. Thank you. Panther. Hi, baby. Time to say hi to the peoples again. There she is. There she is. The peoples are over here. There they are. There they are. Hi, baby. Okay, thank you. The syllogism. The syllogism has been defined as an argument expressed in strict logical form so that its conclusiveness is manifest from the structure of the form alone, without any regard to the meaning of the terms. That's another way of stating that if the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true by the nature of the thing. So you may see the truth of the above definition by stating the argument about the fish that we were just going over as follows. A more general, the form of the argument is all A is Z. As in, all men are mortal. All fish are cold-blooded. All something are something. All A is Z. Now we have some alleged example of A, and we're saying in the second premise, this one is A. Well, therefore, we can conclude this one is also Z. All men are mortal. Socrates, this specific example, is a man. Therefore, this specific example is also mortal. All A is Z. Here's some example of A. So this example of A must also be Z. You'll see that the argument is just as sound in this form as in the fish form. Now I told you, soundness refers to not just the structure at work, but also given the truth of the premises. We use the word sound. Here, he's not clarifying when he says just as sound, that we're assuming the truth of those premises. I think that he is using the sound in a less strict sense. The more strict sense at this point in what he's discussing at this very point, the more strictly correctly used term would be valid. The second fish argument may be stated in this form, with equal force and validity. All A is Z. This case of A is not Z. Therefore, this case of A is not really A. This alleged case of A is not Z, therefore it's not A either. But don't consider that because an argument may proceed to a logical conclusion that the conclusion must necessarily be true. Remember this always. If the major premise is false, it's only going to be necessarily true if the premises are true, if both premises are true. Remember this, if the major premise is false, the conclusion based on it will be false, even though the process of reasoning may be logically correct. This is the difference between validity and soundness. The structure may be perfectly valid. The process of reasoning may be logically correct, but if you don't have both true premises, you won't get a true conclusion. For instance, the moon is made of green cheese. That object is the moon. Therefore, that object must be a fine dwelling place for rats and mice. A syllogism must have three and only three propositions. And these propositions are as follows: the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. We've already said that too. Here is an example of the above. Number one, the major premise is all fish are cold-blooded. Number two, the minor premise is the creature is a fish. And therefore, three, the conclusion is this creature is cold-blooded. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Now, we're not going to enter into the technical exposition of the many rules and principles of correct reasoning by deduction. Those interested in the subject are referred to some good elementary textbook on logic for a more detailed discussion of the same. and many such books exist. Instead, we'll just call your attention to a number of the most common fallacies or forms of false reasoning. And these are very useful to us in our everyday thinking. I already made a reference to one of those. It's called tu quoque. 2 videos ago. Forms of false reasoning, so that by observing the false forms, you may by contrast arrive at an idea of the correct forms. These false forms may thus be usefully employed as a terrible example, serving to warn the student away from the course which has led to such results. And such poor reasoning or forms of false reasoning, common fallacies of reasoning, are used all the time, every day, by many people. And in many cases, they get away with it, so to speak. Not that they were doing it intentionally. Others are doing it quite intentionally. And then use them as manipulation techniques, persuasion techniques. And we get on with the day in accordance with them, falling into step with these. And in many cases, if you point out to somebody that their reasoning is faulty, well, that doesn't win you the argument. Because if they don't buy that, if they don't accept that criticism of their reasoning, it may make no difference in what they believe, or what they are asking of you to do, or what they are accusing you of, or whatever the case may be. As an authority has said, one of Atkinson's or Dumont's unnamed authorities, in learning how to do right, it is always desirable to be informed as to the ways in which we are likely to go wrong. In describing to a person the road which he should follow, we ought to tell him not only the turnings which he is to take, but also the turnings which he is to avoid. Now, similarly, or comparatively, right? Similarly, it is a useful part of logic which teaches us the ways and turnings by which people most commonly go astray in reasoning. So here we get into fallacies, sophistry, and casuistry. 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 I don't know that they spelled this right. Casuistry? Casuistry. All right. That's the new one on me. A fallacy is an unsound argument, or mode of arguing which, while appearing to be decisive of a question, is in reality not so, or a fallacious statement or proposition in which the error is not readily apparent. Perhaps I should have left my entire comment about soundness versus validity out of here, because the author here is using the terms differently, apparently. He says an unsound argument or mode of arguing which, while appearing to be decisive of a question, is in reality not so. It's a fallacious statement or proposition in which the error is not readily apparent. Well, I said soundness has to do with validity or a valid structure plus truth of the premises. What he's referring to here is just the structure of the argument. So, in my terminology, that is currently accepted in current use of terms applied to deductive reasoning. What he's talking about is not an unsound argument, but an invalid one, with what he just said. Now, this was written nearly 100 years ago, so I guess perhaps the terminology was a little bit different back then. Nonetheless, even in going back and forth here now about which word is the right word to use, it's just, I take it to be an additional way to clarify how the stuff works by jumping from one term to another, talking about the same things, okay? It should be helping, I hope helping to clarify the points being made, not the names being given. Sophistry is a fallacy used to deceive others. Sophistry employed to deceive others regarding their moral obligations of rules of conduct is frequently called casuistry. You know what? I read this book before, and I forgot about that word, but I don't recall having run into that word before, because in my studies of logic, which I had some 6 courses that I took academically in critical thinking and logic, we never really got into talking about sophistry very far, especially with regard to using it to deceive others regarding their moral obligations. That's not really part of the formal study of logic or the study of formal logic. That gets off into, well, sophistry and rhetoric, which I didn't specialize in at all, really. Now here follows a collection of the more common forms of fallacy. That's what we're getting at here. And, it's important that he did mention this casuistry. C-A-S-U-I-S-T-R-Y. Casuistry. You see, in our personal involvement, this is my comment here, well, we want to move away in morally cleansing ourselves. We want to move away from doing things like using sophistry to deceive others. And even furthermore, using sophistry to deceive others regarding their moral obligations. Here follows a collection of the more common forms of fallacy with a brief description of the particular character of each, and an indication of that particular point of each in which the false reasoning is hidden. Number 1 is the fallacy of what we commonly refer to as begging the question. Well, what is that? What is it to beg the question? This particular form of fallacy consists of one assuming as a proven and accepted fact something which hasn't been proved, or which at least would not be accepted by the other person were it put squarely before him in the form of a plain question. The gist of this form of fallacy may be said to be in the unwarranted assumption of a premise, usually the major premise. Now here's an example of this fallacy through the following argument expressed as a syllogism. Here's the argument. Good institutions should be united. Church and state are good institutions. Therefore, church and state should be united. Sounds like a valid structure, right? And if the premises were true, well, then we'd have a sound argument. Well, that argument may seem quite reasonable and logical at first thought, like I just said, but a more careful examination will disclose the fact that the major premise, that being good institutions should be united, is a mere impudent assumption lacking proof at all. And it's not likely to be accepted if presented plainly and considered carefully. I mean, it sounds good when stated blandly and with conviction, principally because we accept the minor premise that church and state are good institutions. But there is no logical warrant for the assumption that because institutions are good, that they should then be united. question the major premise, and the whole chain of reasoning is then broken. Many public people habitually violate the laws of sound reasoning in this way. Now here his use of the word sound reasoning does refer to truth in premises. You see what he's doing here, I think, with kind of using the word sound more broadly than we use it when we're being very specific in our talk about logic, is because he's trying to avoid. I think he's just trying to avoid a lot of technical terms. So hair splitting between valid and sound, I think he's just staying away from that. Just using the word sound in a more broad sense than, well, in a more common sense of the use of the word, common use of the word. And that's okay. Many people habitually violate the laws of sound reasoning in this way. They boldly assert a fallacious premise and then proceed to reason or argue logically from it. Excuse me. I was about to sneeze again, just like in the last video, and it stopped. They boldly assert a fallacious premise and then proceed to reason or argue logically from it. The result being that the hearers are confused by the apparently logical nature of the whole argument and the soundness of the conclusion, or the validity of the conclusion, overlooking the important fact that the basic premise itself was unwarranted and unsound. Definitely using the word sound here in a more broad sense than the way it is used in the study of actual formal logic. So if you, I think it's important here for us in our contemporary society, for your interactions here in contemporary society, if you refer to logic at all to people, and in your thinking about it, for you to understand the distinction between soundness and validity, and also how that the word soundness is used by different people in different contexts, it may have different broadnesses of application or broadnesses of reference. Okay? Well, that's good discriminative thought then, right? To understand that and be on the lookout for it, you know. When somebody says soundness, or such and such is sound reasoning, you know that they could be referring to one of several levels of application of the word. I'm glad this did come up like this. Now, such argument and reasoning is rotten at the core. These people who do this proceed on the principle attributed to Aaron Burr, that truth is that which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. Well, there's one idea of what the definition of truth is. That which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. Well, that's getting into sophistry. It also has to do with the persuasive aspect of such practices. Truth is that which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. You know, generally, when we think of the truth value of a proposition, that is, whether it's true or false, we use a different theory of truth, or a different definition of truth. Typically, what we get at, what we mean when we speak of truth, truth is an attribute of language. Propositions can be true or false, not other things, just propositions. They're either true or false. Some people speak of the truth in the world. A better term for that, a more appropriate term for that, is the facts. Facts of the world. Remember, I made a distinction, I believe, in the previous video between language and what language is referring to. It's referring to, if it's meaningful, it's referring to the world. The world has objects and qualities about the objects. The objects have qualities. There are things and then things about the things. Objects and their qualities. In language, in referring to the world, we have subjects and predicates. Similarly, the world has facts, the way things are. With language, if we are correctly referring to those facts, then the equivalent over here in language is truth. Truth being a quality of language. Truth value being a quality of language. Falsity is also a quality of it. So when we're talking about the world here, for us, we have facts. That is, we have things and things about the things. We have things and their qualities. On the language side, we have subjects and predicates. And if we are correctly referring to things and things about things in the world, then we have truth over here on the language side. Subjects, predicates, and truth kind of go together as properties of language. Things, their qualities, and the facts of the matter belong to the world. Truth is that which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. Is a different concept of truth than the one we generally work with now that I have laid out some ideas, the difference, what truth is, what our definition of truth is. Truth we take to be correspondence with reality in language. If our language corresponds with, not just refers to, reference makes it meaningful, but also correctly or refers, then it's truth. Truth is correspondence with reality. Not that which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. Well, such people carry into practice the policy of one of Bulwer's characters, whoever that is, who said, whenever you are about to utter something astonishingly false, always begin with, it is an acknowledged fact, or it is admitted by all, or no thinking person denies the following, or it's just common sense that. And then state your thing that's astonishingly false. Bulwer, the author Bulwer, also makes this character say, Sir Robert Fulmer was a master of this manner of writing. Thus, with a solemn face, that great man attempted to cheat. He would say, it is a truth undeniable that there cannot be any multitude of men whatsoever, either great or small, but that in the same multitude there is one man among them that in nature hath the right to be king of all the rest, as being the next heir of Adam. Well, in all reasoning and argument, therefore, be sure to establish the reasonableness of the premises or the basic facts being presented. It is a truth undeniable. When asserted boldly and then plausibly maintained and argued from and presented in some kind of at least apparently logical or valid form, you can pull the wool over people's eyes pretty easily. Many people won't catch the trick involved. It is true that no reasoning or argument is possible unless we agree to assume as reasonable or proved a certain general or particular proposition. But we're always entitled to take the benefit of the doubt in such a case by challenging the reasonableness of the principle or premise seemingly fallaciously advanced to support the subsequent argument or of chain of reasoning. The subsequent argument of, it says here, but I believe the word should be or, chain of reasoning. Once admit or allowed to pass unchallenged. Once admitted or allowed to pass unchallenged a fallacious premise, and you may be led by the nose into an intellectual quagmire or a morass, where you will sink up to your neck or perhaps over your head. A fallacious premise is like a rotten foundation of a building. That which is erected thereupon may have been correctly or carefully built and be of sound material, but nevertheless the whole building is unsafe, dangerous, and not fit for habitation. It's a good analogy. A writer, another A writer here, unnamed, has given us the following basic rules of sound reasoning and argument. Number one, clearly define your terms and insist upon your opponent doing likewise. Start off by clearly defining your terms. And number two, establish the correctness or the reasonableness of your premises and insist upon the other side doing the same thing. And then number three, observe the laws of sound reasoning from premise to conclusion. Define your terms, establish the truth value or the reasonableness to accept it, the truth value of true of your premises, and insist upon the other person doing the same with both their terms and their premises, and then observe the laws of good reasoning, of valid reasoning from premise to conclusion, or what he calls here sound reasoning. I'm just going to, stick to the differentiation now that I've laid it out. Observe the laws of valid reasoning from premise to conclusion, if we're talking about deductive reasoning here. And if we have established the correctness of the premises, then we will also be engaging in sound reasoning. Just hair splitting. But these are common terms, soundness and validity. So why not know the distinction and understand when the terms are being used in a blurred fashion? Now, the reader will be surprised to discover how many popular ideas, beliefs, and general convictions are based upon arguments and reasoning which beg the question, quite grossly in fact, in their statements of their major premises. The mastermind, excuse me, refuses to be so misled and insists upon the premises being at least reasonable and not mere bald and impudent assertions and assumptions. Now, here is another one. Here is another fallacy. And it often gets confused with the begging of the question one. This one's called circular reasoning, or reasoning in a circle. This is a common one too. This form of fallacy consists in assuming as proof of a proposition the very same proposition itself, stated in another form. Same in substance, different in form. There's the word form again for us. For example, the following proposition. This man is a rascal because he's a rogue. How do we know he's a rogue? Well, he's a rascal. You see, it just goes right around in a circle. Some people get confused about the distinction between begging the question and circular reasoning. So I'm glad here that we're presenting them, the two things, side by side, one following the other, immediately following the other. There is here, of course, no proof here that the man is either a rascal or a rogue. Which brings us close to also begging the question. But this may sound foolish, because many arguments are no sounder than that, or no more valid than that, and are based on the same general principles. And here is an explanation, so to speak, given under this fallacious principle. We're able to see through glass because it's transparent. We call it transparent, and we know that it's transparent because we can see through it. And its transparency is why we're able to see through it. This is a kind of an explanation we might give to a child, and hope the child doesn't ask any more questions. They might just, we're hoping that the person who we speak like this to will go, oh, yeah, okay, and get on with the day. But here are more complex forms of the thing. Here's one. The Republicratic Party is the right one. It's the right party because it advocates the right principles. Furthermore, you know, the Republicratic principles are the right ones because they are advocated by the right party. A lot of people follow this kind of thinking when they go to the voting booth. Or again, the Church of England is the true church because it was established by God. Later on down the road, you might find a person who makes this proposition make this one too. It must have been established by God because it's the true church. So it had to be established by God. Or again, the prophet was inspired. And we know that he was inspired because he himself so stated. And being inspired, he must have then spoken only the truth. It's not stated here, but we're going to loop it back around further. He had to be speaking only the truth because he was inspired, divinely inspired. And he said he was. And he speaks only the truth, right? And why is he speaking only the truth? Because he was inspired. And he's, how do we know that? Because he said so. And he only speaks the truth. You see the circle? There's a lot of that too. When we have a system of thought, an entire system of thought that is kind of locked up in a circular argument like this, let's say, to explicate just a little bit, let's say that this prophet, who we're saying was inspired, and we know that he was inspired because he himself said so, and being inspired, he must have spoken only the truth, and therefore whatever he's saying about him being inspired must actually be the case. Well, let's say we're following all the teachings of this prophet and taking them to be gospel truth because, well, based on this little bit of circular reasoning. And let's say that prophet said, if you question anything I'm saying, well, then you're kind of being a hypocrite to the whole thing here. Kind of locking you in to the belief system proposed by this prophet. And what's your reason for being locked into it? Well, it's because he said it. And he only speaks the truth. And if he also said any other, point of view about the things I'm talking about is false. Don't go there. Because that's evil over there. This manner of presenting an ideology, boiling down to this circular reasoning, therefore the circular reasoning kind of pervades the entirety of the ideology, is called a closed system of thought. It is one which leads us to the assumption that any material outside that system of thought that challenges that system of thought is automatically wrong. And it prevents people from even moving outside that closed system of thought to do any inquiry. It keeps people locked in. It's a closed system of thought. It is not open to anything outside of itself. As another writer has said, this particular form of fallacy is most effective and dangerous when it is employed in long arguments, it being often quite difficult to detect its presence in long discourses, in which the two statements of the same thing, those being in different form, are separated by many other words and thoughts. I already implied that here a moment ago. Moving on to another fallacy. Irrelevant conclusion. This fallacy consists in injecting into the conclusion something not contained in the premises. For example, all men are sinners. Okay? John Smith is a man. Therefore, John Smith is a horse thief. Horse thief wasn't in the premises. So there's like a little step skipped there. How do we get from sinner to horse thief? I mean, it should be clear here that if all men are sinners, if that's true, and John Smith is in fact a man, is he therefore automatically a horse thief? No. Even if we consider that horse thievery is sinning, it doesn't mean that we would have to assume that all sinners are horse thieves. That's not stated here either. That's how we can say that the horse thief just kind of pops up out of nowhere in the conclusion. It wasn't in the premises. Many solemn statements made by public men and others are equally quite as absurd as that one just stated. It's kind of a crooked way of going about things. Crooked as a dog's hind leg. Many solemn statements made by public people and others are really quite as absurd as that one just stated, though the absurdity is often lost sight of in the extended statement and the complicated presentation aided by the solemn, positive air of authority assumed by the speaker. Think of campaign speeches, think of politicians. They are rhetoricians. Most of them are pretty good rhetoricians. Most of them. Not all. I'm not going to overgeneralize here. I think I'm saying something that appeals to rather common knowledge. I think so. I'm hoping so. is my intent. We find this a lot in political speeches. There's a solemn atmosphere. There's a positive air of authority. There's an air of authority and a positively presented one. And we have extended statements. We have very good rhetorical tools being used. You know, the rule of threes is being used a lot. You know, like, we want freedom. We want justice. We want what's right. You know, things like that. You know, they're all worked in. All very kind of persuasive. Kind of causes us to overlook absurdities such as irrelevant conclusions. A more plausible form is as follows. All thieves are liars. John Brown is a liar. Therefore, John Brown is a thief. Notice the difference here. Remember our fundamental syllogism, major premise. Something like, all men are mortal. And then the minor premise, John Brown is a man, therefore John Brown is mortal. That works. Notice the difference here. All thieves are liars. That is equivalent to all men are mortal. The minor premise was John Brown is a liar, not John Brown is a thief. The equivalent with our classic syllogism would be all men are mortal. John Brown is mortal, not John Brown is a man. John Brown is mortal, therefore John Brown is a man. That doesn't work. That does not give us a necessarily true conclusion. All men are mortal. John Brown is mortal, therefore John Brown is a man. Well, there may be other things than men that are mortal. So it does not necessarily mean John Brown is a man. John Brown could be a horse if we're going to accept that men are mortal along the same lines as, you know, horses are mortal. John Brown could be a horse, not a man. But we're throwing out the conclusion, the irrelevant conclusion, you know, that John Brown has to be a man just because he's mortal. See, that form doesn't work. Therefore, John Brown is a thief in our current example. In this last, the statement ignores the fact that while all thieves are liars, all liars are not necessarily thieves. Just like not all mortal things are necessarily men. Remember the old saying, all biscuits are bread, but all bread is not biscuit. All biscuits are bread, but all bread is not biscuit. The next one, false cause. This fallacy consists in assuming a false relation of cause and effect. This one happens a lot in everyday life. A lot. This fallacy consists in assuming a false relation of cause and effect between things merely occurring at the same time at the same place. A coincidence, not necessarily a cause. Typical example. The cock crows just before sunrise. Therefore, the cock crow causes the sun to rise. Well, let me tell you something about cock crowing. Many a rooster has been heard to crow at all times of day. This whole idea about the rooster crows just before sunrise. Well, yeah, the rooster crows just before sunrise. It crows 24/7. I used to live, well, where I currently live, my neighbor, one of my neighbors, not the good neighbor who got in the car and took off in the immediately preceding video. You know, we heard a car start because I was recording outside. And I said, good neighbor. Well, my other good neighbor on the other side. When I first moved here, had a bunch of roosters in a little pen. And one of the edges of that pen was about 10 feet or less from my bedroom window. And yes, those roosters, they all did their little thing, their vocal thing, just before sunrise. They did. But it didn't wake me up. Because I was already awake. Because they were doing that all night long. And they would do it all day long, too. It was just about endless. So yeah, the cock crows just before sunrise. It also does it a lot of other times, too. Well, what we're saying here is, our little argument is, the cock crows just before sunrise. Therefore, the cock crow causes the sun to rise. Well, that just seems absurd, right? Because we know it doesn't work that way. But what if we didn't know it doesn't work that way? And somebody presented that to us? We would have a little bit of a problem, because they're implicating a cause and effect relationship where there really isn't one. There's furthermore a problem here, as I know from my neighbor's roosters. Well, they don't have the roosters anymore. I haven't heard a peep. Not even a peep for some years now. But there would be a problem. If the cocks crowing caused the sun to rise, and I've told you, my experience was that those cocks crowed all day long and most of the night too, what they would actually be doing is not just causing the sun to rise. It would be true they're causing the sun to rise. They'd also be causing it to give the appearance of going all the way around the earth every day. Here's another one. The Democratic administration was accompanied by bad crops. The Demo-Publican administration was accompanied by bad crops. Therefore, the Demo-Publican Party in power is the cause of bad crops, and therefore should be kept out of power. Here's another one. Where civilization is highest, there we find the greatest number of high silk hats. Therefore, high silk hats are the cause of high civilization. In the same way, a symptom or a consequence of a condition is often mistaken for the cause of the condition. How about that? That one is kind of common. And at least some of the times accepted. A symptom or a consequence of a condition is often mistaken as the cause of the condition. Be careful. Burden of proof. The next one, burden of proof. It's a favorite device of sophistical reasoners to attempt without due warrant to throw the burden of proof upon the opponent. This is really common. To throw the burden of proof upon the opponent, particularly when this is employed to establish the truth of the sophist's contentions, because the opponent is unable to prove that it isn't true. The absurdity and fallacious nature of this is more clearly perceived when the proposition is illustrated by a ridiculous example. As for instance, the moon is made of green cheese. This must be admitted by you to be true, because you can't prove to the contrary. That's a ridiculous example of it. There's one that isn't going to fly very well, but it's the form of the thing. And when it does happen in everyday life, when that form does show up in everyday life, usually the given instantiation of that form, that given instance of it, isn't quite so isn't so clearly ridiculous. The answer to such a fallacious argument is, of course, the statement that the burden of proof rests upon the person making the statement, not on his opponent. The burden of proof isn't on the other person to prove that the statement is false. The burden of proof is on the person making the statement to prove that his statement is true. Do you remember? I want to make a connection here. Do you remember? I mentioned, in talking about scientific method or scientific reasoning, we currently have added into our idea of what a good scientific theory is that it is falsifiable. We mentioned its explanatoriness, and the capacity for that explanatoriness to have the characteristic of being able to predict, and the characteristic of being able to control. Right? We mentioned fruitfulness. We mentioned scope. We mentioned the explanation ultimately boiling down to mathematics. We mentioned empirical evidence. We mentioned intersubjective confirmation. And we also mentioned falsifiability. Do you remember that? Falsifiability. The ability to know what it would take to prove the theory false. If a proposed theory could not be proven false, if it in fact were false, if there would be no way to prove it, then we don't accept it as a scientific theory. That didn't used to be a criterion for something to be a scientific theory. Oh, another criterion that I suggested for something to be the accepted theory among a choice of theories is simplicity. Often it comes down to, if all other characteristics, all other criterion are equal, then the simpler of the two explanations is generally the accepted one. That was another kind of criteria. But a necessary condition for something to be a scientific theory these days I mean, not all these criterion are essential to the acceptance of a theory as being a scientific one. But we want something. We want an explanation to have broad scope. We want it to be fruitful. But how fruitful and how much scope is kind of up to, is a relative affair. But when it comes to falsifiability, that's a rather solid, well-defined, in place, necessary condition for something to be a scientific theory. Falsifiability. Because beforehand, before this falsifiability criterion, there were many accepted theories accepted in this called scientific theories called scientific theories, and they weren't falsifiable. We wouldn't know what it would take to make them false, or we wouldn't be able to prove them false. So they'd be thrown in, and called science. And then because they were called science, they were just accepted to be the way things are. accepted to be true, to correspond with reality, to correspond with facts. And you see, the kind of thing going on behind the scenes was the people presenting the theory, this unfalsifiable theory, was getting away with it because nobody else could prove the thing false. Like the burden of proof was on them to do that. On other people. Like the burden of proof had been placed on the public to prove the thing false. And insofar as the public couldn't do that, then the public was, because it's coming from science, kind of in the position to accept the whole thing as being the case. They were kind of like at a loss to do anything else about it. Because the burden of proof was being placed in the wrong place. For example, a psychologist. Some of this still goes on. Let's say you go to the shrink, and the shrink says you're in denial. Let's say, you know that you have a certain difficulty, emotional difficulty, that manifests, wait a minute, never mind the emotional difficulty. Let's just say you have a drug addiction, and you damn well know it. And you've been seeking help for quite a while, and you've found that certain forms of help aren't working for you, and you have an idea that you know exactly what kind of help will. Let's say you've been going for help, and the help you've been getting is in the form of attack therapy, or, tough love. And you don't respond well to tough love, because let's say you grew up in a family where that's all you got. And it really, it kind of set you off on a wrong course in life, because you have you're of kind of a, I don't know, let's just make this up. You have a somewhat sensitive nature, and this whole tough love and attack therapy type of growing up environment made you very turned off to people giving you the tough love thing. And so now, this all works into your drug addiction in life, and you've gone to a couple of recovery houses. And what they've done is given you a bunch of tough love. Just verbal attacking you in their attempt, with good intention, to kind of tear down your current ways of thinking and get you swung around to their way of thinking. But it's not working. And you know it. And you know your life is at stake here. You understand the situation you're in with your drug addiction. I mean, you're trying to get help. You know you have the addiction. You've watched it develop through life. You understand the consequences that it's been having on you, maybe not all of them. You even feel guilty about the consequences it's been having on other people. And you also are quite aware that you are looking for help. You're admitting your difficulty. You are aware of the nature of it. Okay? You've read books about it. You've taken this all of this information on as your own. You've accepted it. You've ingested it. You've assimilated it. You're having direct experience of it, and you need help, and you want help. And these various forms of instantiations of attack therapy aren't helping. They're just making you feel worse, and they're kind of like feeding your drug addiction, right? And you go to a shrink finally. You stop going to recovery houses, and you go to a psychologist who does drug counseling. You pull together the money somehow, and you go pay a counselor somewhere, a drug counselor or a psychologist, and this psychologist starts right off with the assumption, a very common assumption about people with drug addictions, that they are in denial. They are in denial of their whole addictive process, of the effects they're having on other people, what they're doing to themselves. They're in denial. They're in denial, so they need broken down. They need to come to terms with the fact that they have an addiction, that they have a problem. And so they start off with this, and you say, no, I'm not in denial. And then they tell you you're trying to manipulate them. They tell you you're trying to run the show here. And they start up with their attack therapy again, to try to break you down and admit to having an addiction when you walked into the darn office saying, I am an addict and I need help. Well, my point here is, when they accuse you of being in denial, how do you prove them wrong? This defense mechanism called denial, how do you prove it to be wrong? All you can say is, no, I'm not. But it's you, a drug addict, in the face of an authority. Somebody educated and experienced with drug addicts, educated about drug addiction and experienced with drug addicts. So all they have to do is just stand firm, right? Boldly assert and maintain their assertion. You're in denial. I know you're in denial because denial is common to all drug addicts. You can't tell me otherwise. I'm the doctor here. When actually the burden of proof is on them to prove that you're in denial. But they're not accepting the burden of proof. They're not even proposing that you try to prove them wrong. But the only way to get around this whole denial accusation would be to prove them wrong, and you can't do it. Even if you offer them plenty of evidence that they're wrong, even if you give it your best shot, they won't accept it because they don't take it as proof at all. They'll just sidestep and bring up something else like, well, you're manipulating me now. You're making this up. You are in denial and you just don't know it. You're denying your denial. They're placing the burden of proof on you, and you quite often give up and just go along with it and play their game. And so you're off into a whole sidetrack that might or might not be of any help, depending on your disposition toward this whole thing. You might just figure that you're, sitting in front of a buffoon, a manipulator, but you don't have much choice because you've now laid out all the money you have, and you have to follow through, or because the judge sent you there. And anyway, burden of proof, falsifiability. The answer to such a fallacious argument is, of course, the statement that the burden of proof rests upon the person making the statement, not on his opponent, and that proof does not consist in a mere absence of disproof, but rather in the positive evidence advanced to support the proposition that's been advanced. In this connection, one recalls the old story about the lawyer in court who produced three men who swore that he saw John Doe strike Richard Roe. John Doe strike Richard Roe. Whereupon the other side offered to produce 100 men to swear that they didn't see him do it. Well, this sounded well until it was shown that none of the 100 men were present at the scene of the fight at all. Burden of proof. In that case, the burden of proof was still on the side of the accuser. Abusive opponent is another one. It is no argument or true reasoning to abuse. It is no argument. The word true wasn't there. It is no argument or true reasoning to oppose the opponent or the general character of those holding contrary opinions. This is a direct evolution of the ancient arguments of beating the opponent over the head with a club and then claiming a logical victory. This sometimes still happens in our society in another form. I mean, this physicalized version of it, okay? Sometimes we run into people who seem to evolutionarily perhaps just moved over into humanity from like their previous incarnation was something in the animal kingdom, where in accordance with the most occult teachings in the evolution of how evolution occurs from kingdom to kingdom, going from one of the animals types, categories that does eventually evolve into humanity. When such an instance, when such a particular animal moves from the group soul level to the individual soul level, therefore into humanity, they go from like the very advanced level of animalhood into a very bestial or low level of evolvement in the next kingdom up, humanity. So certain of these people seem to have, just work from instinctive mind quite a lot. And you get into a little logical argument, and the person suggests that the argument gets, settled by means of kicking your ass. Let's take it outside. That'll prove the point. So if they get to drag you outside and then kick your butt, then they walk off saying they've proven their point. That ought to teach them. You know what I mean? Likewise, it is not a sound argument nor logical reasoning to appeal from the principle under consideration to the personal practices of the person advocating the practice. For instance, a man arguing the advantages of temperance may be very intemperate himself, but to point to his intemperate habits is no proof or argument that the principle of temperance is incorrect. We hear this kind of thing happen a lot. Somebody might talk about principles of good nourishment, good physical nourishment, healthy diet, and that person may be obese. Well, to point to their obesity as a disproof or degradation of the point the guy is trying to make, or the woman is trying to make, isn't good reasoning. When a person fails to live up to the principles that he or she teaches to be, a person fails to live up to the principles he or she teaches to be correct. Many. It may be logically argued in the above case that belief in temperance does not always cause a person to be temperate. But there is no proof here that the practice of temperance is not advisable. In fact, the person's habits may even be urged as an argument in favor of temperance rather than against it. And one might say, well, yeah, I engage in poor reasoning, but I'm advocating good reasoning. In my life, I don't exhibit much good reasoning, but I'm certainly advocating good reasoning. And a person would say, well, I'm not going to listen to you, for goodness sakes. Look at how you reason in your everyday life. You don't even have any common sense. What the heck? What are you talking about? Why should I listen to you? You might say back, trust me, I, of all people, know the importance of good reasoning because I suffer from the lack of it every day. I have some direct experience with what life is like when it's not used. When good reasoning is not used. And besides, still the point is, the fact that I may use poor reasoning quite a lot in my everyday life is no argument in favor of poor reasoning or against good reasoning. It's quite a difference. The principle of good reasoning versus my behavior, my mental behavior. The fallacy is readily detected when one considers that the man may change his habits so as to square with his beliefs. That could happen. And in such a case, it cannot be held that a change in the man's habits changes the principle from being untrue to true. All of a sudden, a proposition is either true or untrue, regardless of the personal character of the person advocating or presenting it. The next fallacy is prejudice. Prejudice is an unreasonable predilection for or objection to anything, especially an opinion or leaning an opinion or a leaning adverse to anything without just grounds or before sufficient knowledge. Prejudice arises from feeling, not from reason. Take away from prejudice the feeling element therein, and there's little left to it. When we form judgments from feeling, we frequently perpetrate fallacy. And yet, the average person performs the greater part of his decisions and makes the greatest number of his judgments in this way. He is ruled by prejudice rather than by reason. A writer says, many persons reason from their feelings rather than from their intellect. They seek and advance not true reasons, but excuses. They seek to prove a thing to be true simply because they want it to be true. The tendency is to see only those facts which agree with our likes, how true that is, or are in line with our prejudices, how true that is, and to ignore the other sets of facts. And I will propose furthermore that we filter information coming in through our senses. We filter it. It's tainted. It's colored. And in an occult sense, literally colored by our beliefs, by our biases, by our presuppositions, by our current conceptual framework, and by our expectations, by our prejudices. It's very easy to interpret another person's intentions as being negative if we already have an idea formed about that person that his intentions are negative. Or if we already have an idea that all people are up to no damn good most of the time. Or if we ourselves are up to no good most of the time, and therefore by comparing, by believing that we understand other people, because we compare our ideas of other people with our idea of ourselves or our own way of seeing the world and being in the world, well then, if we ourselves are up to no good most of the time, we'll automatically assume, by way of mental filtering, what we perceive from other people as being up to no good all the time. Our worldview has a lot to do with how we perceive information from the world, which tends to support our worldview. Unless we get a better grip on how this stuff works and the fallacies involved in perpetuating an erroneous worldview, or in thwarting the evolution of our worldview, and in forwarding our personal evolvement. Applying these principles, these understandings, applying our knowledge of these fallacies and trying to avoid them for ourselves, even if we can't, convince other people with whom we come into contact in our everyday lives, who go about these fallacious ways of thinking and persuasion right in our faces, even if we can't change the outcomes very well with them. Like you say, if it's our boss, and our boss is a little hostile, and if you start pointing out that his reason is fallacious, he's just going to accuse you of talking about stuff he has no clue about, and that you're just trying to stall his time, which wastes his money, and you're not a good employee anymore, and maybe he's going to get rid of you. I have experience with this kind of thing, right? Regardless of all of that being the case, and sometimes just having to give in to get by, sometimes having to do that, not put up the logical argument, but just kind of follow along to avoid lots of further difficulties by people who are very good at jumping to other kinds of fallacious reasoning, on and on, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, and ad nauseum. If only for your own personal thinking with respect to information and techniques, cognitive and practical instruction, and important aspects of, component parts of your personal evolvement. It's the main reason why we're presenting this material here in this playlist. I mean, that's the relevance of it for us. Many people reason from their feelings rather than from their intellect. They seek and advance not true reasons but excuses. They seek to prove a thing to be true simply because they want it to be true. The tendency is to see only facts which agree with our likes or are in line with our prejudices, and to ignore other sets of facts. Such persons unconsciously assume the mental attitude, which may be expressed as follows: if the facts don't agree with my pet theories or prejudices, so much the worse for the facts. Now, what does this sound like? Something we've discussed here before. Anomalous test results in the scientific community and in what we would call scientific thinking. Often progress is not made, true progress is not made, because anomalous test results are kind of ignored. Whereas they should say there's something wrong with the theory. We maintain the theory and just say, well, something kind of weird happened with nature. Something kind of weird happened with the world there. We'll just kind of brush that under the carpet. Because the facts turned out to not agree with the pet theory. Brushing it under the carpet is saying the equivalent to saying so much the worse for the facts. The theory stays. Another writer says, 9 times out of 10, to argue with any man on a subject that engages his emotions is to waste your breath. And this is why it's a good idea to not talk politics or religion in the workplace. Because that person's mind is not open to logical persuasion at all. And when people have their bottom line, their money in mind, or this is in an interpersonal relationship where there is a lot of emotion at stake, or control issues at stake. There's a lot of emotion involved. And to argue with anybody in these conditions often amounts to a waste of breath, because that other person's mind is not open to logical persuasion. And this is why we can say, well, you just committed to quoque fallacy. You're saying that I did the same thing. I have the same problem I'm saying you're having. Therefore, shut up. And you might say, hey, wait a minute. I have nothing to do with this. We're talking about you. If that person is not open to logical persuasion, to your logical rebuttal of their counter-argument, of their fallacious counter-argument to what you're trying to present to them, you're not going to get anywhere with them. Because their mind is not open to logical persuasion. Such a person's emotions first determine their opinion and then prompt logical faculties to devise plausible excuses for it. Let me repeat that. 9 times out of 10, to argue with any man on a subject that engages his emotions is to waste breath, because his mind is not open to logical persuasion. His emotions first determine his opinion, and then they prompt his logical faculties to devise plausible excuses for his opinion. There is a thing that psychologists call a complex. So here we're talking about psychologists again. A complex. It consists of an idea charged with emotion, and it operates as a sort of colored screen in front of the mind. I was just referring to colored and screening or filtering. Here we are. A man whose emotions are deeply engaged on one side of a question may think that he is reasoning about it. But in fact, he may be incapable of reasoning about it, because whatever impressions his mind receives in that connection come through his complex. His logical faculties operate only by way of inventing plausible defenses for the judgment his emotions have already formed. His logical faculties thereby operate only by way of inventing plausible defenses for the judgments his emotions have already formed. So it's impossible to change his position in any respect by reasoning, because reason cannot touch his mind until his emotions have dealt with it and made it conform to their color. Whenever you talk to a person with a strong bias on any particular subject, which bias does not coincide with your own, talk to him about something else. Now notice these references to the word, the uses of the word color here. Most readers and listeners would take that to be a metaphorical use of the word. As occultists, as people, as we, now having been introduced to the idea of thought forms and colors associated with them, colors associated with thought, take this more literally. Another fallacy, illogical deduction. There are a number of phases of fallacy arising from the violation of the technical rules of the syllogism itself, which violation results in deduction opposed to the principles of logic. Deduction opposed to the principles of logic. It's still deduction, but it's not valid deduction in this case. These points are too technical to be considered in detail here, and I agree. and the reader who wishes to pursue the subject further is referred to some elementary textbook in the subject of logic. Now, the following general considerations, taken from different writers, will perhaps prove of interest and of use to you in your consideration of the general principles of reasoning. A writer says, most of the work of effective thinking consists in the observance of a few elementary maxims as follows. 1. All proof begins with something which cannot be proved, but can only be perceived or accepted, and is called an axiom or a first principle. Number 2. There can be no argument save between those who accept the same first principle. And number 3, an act can only be judged by defining its object. And number 4, anything can be defended which is not a contradiction in terms. A very slender equipment of such tests would save many people from wasting their time and conscience upon discussions and argument of which they realize neither the origin or the end. And another writer says, there is no royal road to the cultivation of the reasoning faculties. There is, by the old familiar rule, practice, practice, practice. Nevertheless, there are certain studies which tended to develop the faculties in question. The study of arithmetic, especially mental arithmetic, tends to develop correct habits of reasoning from one truth to another, from cause to effect. Better still is the study of geometry. And best of all, is the study of logic and the practice of working out its problems and its examples, learning its theorems and applying them in a systematic program of working out its problems and examples. The study of philosophy and psychology also is useful in this way. Well, this was written about 100 years ago, before the American Psychological Association formed. And I am not so clear anymore on whether the study of psychology will be useful in this way. I think that he's referring to the practical psychology of the day, which he, the author, engages quite a lot in his own writings. We're talking about, Raja Yoga and so forth, and material just like this. Raja Yoga, mental discipline training, these things do follow logical sequences and tend to awaken your reasoning skills because of the practices involved, right? And because certain of those practices do directly address reasoning skills like this that's happening right now. And because your reasoning skills are called upon to go about your personal evolution in a healthy manner. But that at points requires, somebody creating a logical checkpoint for you, which we've done here in this playlist. The study of logic will aid in the development of the power of deductive reasoning in the least. And it does this first by showing the method by which we reason, to see the laws which govern the reasoning process, to analyze the syllogism and see its conformity to the laws of thought. It is not only an exercise of reasoning, but also gives that knowledge of the process that will be both a stimulus and a guide to thought. No one can trace the principles and processes of thought without receiving thereby an impetus to thought. And in the second place, the study of logic is probably even more valuable because it gives practice in deductive thinking. This perhaps is its principal value, since the mind reasons instinctively without knowing how it reasons. Now, one can think without the knowledge of the science of thinking. Yep. Just as one can use language correctly without a knowledge of grammar. Yet as the study of grammar improves one's speech, so the study of logic can improve one's thought. We cannot infer anything we please from any premises that we please. We must conform to certain definite rules or principles, and any violation of them will be a fallacy. There are two simple rules which should not be violated. Number one, the subject matter in the conclusion that we form should be of the same general kind as those in the premises. And number two, the facts constituting the premises must be accepted and must not be fictitious. And when you find yourself fluctuating back and forth between two opinions, you might find it helpful to hold an internal debate. State to yourself as strongly as possible the case for the affirmative, and then put as convincingly as possible the case for the negative, and hold a refutation if necessary. You may even elaborate this by writing the arguments for both sides in parallel columns. Of course, you should never use an argument which you can see on its face to be fallacious, nor a statement which represents merely a prejudice and nothing more. You should use only such arguments as you think a sincere debater would conscientiously employ. And by thus making your reasons articulate, you will find that there is really no tenable case at all for one side, and you will seldom fail to reach a definite conclusion. And again, the pragmatic method can be applied with profit to nearly all of our positive problems. Before starting to solve a question, while deciding, for instance, on the validity of some nice distinction in logic, we should ask ourselves, what practical difference will it make if I hold one opinion or another? How will my belief influence my action? Using the word action here in its broadest sense, to include something like a further mental action. This may often lead our line of inquiry into more fruitful channels, keeping us from making fine but needless distinctions, to help us to word our question more relevantly, lead us to make distinctions where we really need them. The mastermind detaches itself from its mental machinery and tools occasionally and as a matter of exercise, and enters into the full realization of its real existence and its real supremacy. Over its mental field, it exclaims to itself, "I am the master of all this." Well, you may take this to be a reference to the true ego, behind the mind, in control of the mind, using the mind as a tool, an instrument, what we might call individual mind, okay? Just apply everything you know about true ego, true self, all of that here, okay? I am the master of all this. The true ego is the master of all this. And in this spirit, it imposes its authority upon its tools and machinery. One of those tools being mental processes, right? And it bids them to perform its work efficiently and intelligently. And when feeling is necessary to stimulate thought and intellectual behavior, the master mind pulls the lever of feeling and emotion and throws its power into the machinery as a tool. Not as a slave, not as a not being a slave to the feeling and emotion, but throwing it in where it's going to help. And likewise, when it receives that feeling and emotion, when it perceives that feeling and emotion are clogging and gumming up the free movement of the intellectual machinery tool, then the mastermind reverses that emotional lever and decreases its power. And what is the power that enables these motions to take place? These controls of mental and emotional energy? Will. In short, the ego, the true self, the mastermind, and the mind master takes the central place of power and authority, as I have termed it before in this playlist. Do you recall the term? Core control. Control from the core. takes the central place of power and authority and manages, controls, and directs the entire mental machinery. The methods which we have indicated and pointed out in this chapter are but suggestions to the mastermind as to how it may obtain the best, most profitable, and the most confident work out of its mental machinery concerned with thought and reasoning. But the real direction must come from the mastermind itself in the form of will. The intellect is like a good servant, and will listen carefully to and faithfully obey the commands issued to it by the mastermind through the medium of will. In this chapter, we have pointed out to the mastermind just how its intellectual machinery works and operates, and how it may be directed efficiently. But the mastermind must actually exercise its directing and controlling power itself. Direct experience must be engaged in. See, the intellect may be compared to a high-powered automobile. The mastermind is the driver thereof. And these chapters are the book of directions, which the driver studies and whose principles he applies. But at the last, the driver must do the real driving, steering, and directing. His hand touches the buttons and pulls the levers and shuts on and off the power of the will to or from certain parts of the machinery. The efficient chauffeur always drives the machine. He never allows the machine to run away with him. And the mastermind should follow the example of the good chauffeur. That is the conclusion of mastering reason in William Walker Atkinson's a.k.a. Theron Q. Dumont in his book Mastermind. Be well.